On the morning of the 16th of February 1945, Japanese soldiers defending the volcanic island of Iwo Jima peered out of their defensive positions and were greeted by an awe-inspiring sight. Hundreds of US naval warships were visible only miles offshore, having travelled the vast waters of the Pacific Ocean. Within the hour, B-24 Liberator heavy bombers arrived to pummel the island, causing the powdery volcanic sand to erupt into the air with a geyser-like effect. Following the departure of the Liberators, American battleships, cruisers and destroyers opened a sustained barrage using shells of every available caliber. The rain of steel would last for the next 3 days, marking the culmination of one of the most vicious and sustained bombardments yet seen in military history. However, when 70,000 men from 3 US Marine divisions stormed ashore on the 19th of February, they were met with an incredible volume of firepower from an enemy which had somehow survived the carnage inflicted upon them. The Marines suffered over 26,000 casualties in the battle of attrition which followed, only subduing the Japanese after 36 days of bloody combat. To the shock of many senior US naval officers, that almost 3 months of continuous bombing and shelling prior to the invasion had not destroyed the Japanese defenders, who were able to conduct a ferocious defense of the island. The failure of the seemingly impressive pre-invasion barrage to wipe out the Japanese garrison defending Iwo Jima has been the subject of fierce debate. Ultimately, the bombardment did not have its intended impact due to Japanese tactics which took advantage of the island's terrain, poor weather in the critical days leading up to the invasion, and the mistaken belief that Iwo Jima would be an easy target to conquer. The planned bombardment for Operation Detachment, the invasion of the island, followed what had become a familiar script for the United States Navy in the Pacific Theatre. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and rocket ships, along with carrier aircraft, would pound suspected enemy positions. In some cases, the pre-invasion barrages proved very successful. During the Marshall Islands campaign, the atolls of Roi and Namur were subjected to intense bombardments, which destroyed incomplete Japanese defences and resulted in quick American victories. However, the Battle of Peleliu represented an instance where the barrage failed to dent extensively fortified enemy positions, forcing the Marines into a bloody fight. The commander of the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, employed superior defensive tactics which made use of the island's unique terrain. In the months prior to the invasion, the 7th Air Force dropped 5,800 tons of munitions on the island, blanketing the volcanic landscape with high explosives. The continuous bombing quickly destroyed the garrison of Japanese aircraft based on the island, as well as obliterating any structures above the surface. The American intelligence officers who studied reconnaissance photos simply could not believe that anything could survive the aerial onslaught, counting 5,000 bomb craters in 1 square mile alone. A pilot on leave in Saipan bragged to a Marine, "All you guys will have to do is clean up. No one could survive what we've been dropping." Yet, this couldn't be further from the truth, as the softening up operations ultimately had a negligible effect on the enemy defences. General Kuribayashi's strategy of waiting until the Marines were ashore to open fire also had an impact. Throughout the pre-invasion barrage, the carefully concealed Japanese heavy guns mostly held fire as Kuribayashi was intent on conserving ammunition without exposing his defensive positions. With no muzzle flashes to aim for, the invaders could not locate the bunkers and blockhouses which contained the defenders. Even in short windows of good weather, the pilots of American spotter aircraft soon grew frustrated by the lack of identifiable targets. The topography of Iwo Jima itself contributed to the unsuccessful barrage. Although Mount Suribachi was the most prominent natural landmark on the island, it was not the key to the Japanese strategy. Rather, the northern half of Iwo Jima was where General Kuribayashi had constructed his main defensive line. This area was marked by rocky and broken ground, which provided natural cover for many emplacements and bunkers. In the months prior to the invasion, Japanese engineers carefully identified positions which could not be spotted or destroyed by American bombardment. As such, when the Marines fought their way north following the landings, they found that many enemy blockhouses and caves could not be targeted by the fleet's warships, due to the trajectory of shelling. Instead, they could only be destroyed by direct artillery fire or by brute infantry assault. Following the end of the battle, many American observers were left speechless by the extensive Japanese tunnel system which provided shelter for the defenders. They waited out the bombardment in over 1,500 underground rooms, most of which were electrified, had plaster walls and were fully ventilated. The sheer depth of many of these subterranean tunnel systems made them impervious to American bombs and shells. In fact, General Kuribayashi's headquarters was built 75 feet below the surface. The underground system was almost entirely interconnected, which allowed Japanese soldiers to move from one position to the next without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Altogether, there were more than 11 miles of tunnels built into Iwo Jima, longer than the length of the entire island itself. Following the battle, Captain Tom Fields of the 26th Marine Regiment somberly concluded that the Japanese weren't on Iwo Jima, they were in Iwo Jima. The weather severely curtailed attempts at pulverizing Japanese defences on the island. When the invasion fleet arrived off Iwo Jima on the 16th of February, it was expected that the naval warships and ground attack aircraft would have 34 hours of daylight to saturate suspected enemy positions with high explosives. Despite the bombardment beginning on schedule, low clouds and rain squalls immediately enveloped the island, which prevented carrier aircraft and heavy bombers from carrying out their missions. As such, many aircraft were forced to return to base without releasing their payloads. More importantly, the rain grounded American reconnaissance flights, whose mission was to relay fire mission coordinates to the warships. To avoid wasting shells, the Naval Bombardment Group was only ordered to fire on targets which had been located by spotter planes. The weather was clear on the 17th of February, which allowed for a full day of heavy bombardment by both ships and aircraft. Yet, the rain closed in again on the 18th, which caused further cancellations of airstrikes and shelling. By the time the Marines hit the shores on the morning of the 19th, the planned 34 hours of bombardment had dwindled to just 13. The 62% reduction in shelling was to have fatal consequences for the young Marine infantrymen once the invasion began. A cavalier attitude on the part of senior US officers negatively impacted the Navy's ability to provide the necessary bombardment. The commander of the operation, General Holland Smith, requested 10 days of heavy bombardment to soften up the Japanese defences, but was instead informed that the Navy could only provide 3 days of shelling. He was informed that this was due to limitations on the availability of ships, difficulties of ammunition replacement, and the loss of surprise. Smith had commanded the attack on the tiny atoll of Tarawa in 1943, where the pre-invasion barrage had lasted less than 6 hours. When the assault began, the Marines suffered 30% casualties on the first day alone, as they found that the above-ground Japanese defences had barely been touched by naval gunfire. Furthermore, General Smith inspected the enemy fortifications on Tarawa following the end of the battle and discovered that even direct hits from bombs and shells had only partially damaged many emplacements. The defences on Iwo Jima were far more advanced than on Tarawa, but Smith's warnings were not taken seriously by Naval High Command. Another reason for the insufficient bombardment support was a misallocation of resources by General Smith's superiors in the US Navy, such as Rear Admiral William Blandy. As the commander of the Bombardment Support Group, Blandy refused to extend the barrage because he was worried that his ships would run out of shells before the Marines stormed the island. Because of Blandy's concerns, gun crews aboard the bombardment ships had been ordered to conserve as much ammunition as possible, which fostered an overall reluctance to unleash the full might of American firepower on the small island. Critically, other warships originally intended to support the invasion were instead diverted to other missions before the fleet reached Iwo Jima, which further weakened the impact of the shelling. General Smith and the commander of the Marine Landing Force, Major General Harry Schmidt, were infuriated by the lack of cooperation from the Navy, but could do nothing to extend the bombardment. Smith's Chief of Staff, Colonel Dudley Brown, somberly predicted before the invasion that the cost in Marines killed will be far greater because naval support has been so weakened as to jeopardize the success of the operation. Yet, the barrage was effective at times, and certainly saved lives during the invasion. In fact, when the American warships were able to pinpoint Japanese positions, their accurate fire pulverized even the most heavily defended enemy bunkers one by one. On the 17th of February, the battleship USS Tennessee and the heavy cruiser Pensacola moved within range of Japanese 20mm artillery pieces which opened fire. Pensacola was damaged, but the enemy positions had finally been exposed. The Japanese gun emplacements were quickly identified and engaged at point-blank range by the superior firepower of the US Navy. After a sharp exchange, the battleships Texas, Nevada and Tennessee obliterated the enemy heavy guns. A Japanese radio man on the island, Tsurugi Akikusa, later said that the Americans weren't content to simply knock out the positions. They blasted them again and again to grind the broken rubble into dust. Following the counter-battery barrage on the 17th, the Japanese gunners were forced to adapt and demonstrated more strict fire discipline for the rest of the battle. It is likely that the Marines would have faced even heavier Japanese fire on D-Day, as well as suffering much higher casualties had the barrage not taken place at all. Yet, at the same time, the mere 3 days of bombardment was still wholly insufficient at neutralising enemy defences, ensuring that the Marines would face a brutal fight once they landed on the island. As the bombardment of Iwo Jima reached a crescendo on the morning of D-Day, 19th of February, nervous American soldiers hoped the ferocious barrage might wipe out the defenders. As his amphibious tractor motored towards the invasion beach, a young Marine turned to his friend and joked, "Do you think there will be any Japanese left for us?" When the Marines reached the shoreline and faced no enemy fire, even some of the veterans started to think that over 10,000 tons of high explosives had destroyed the enemy. Yet, after an hour of the Americans unloading men and material on the island, General Kuribayashi gave the order for his guns to open fire on the crowded beach. The Japanese barrage inflicted hundreds of casualties and quickly dispelled the notion that the months of bombing had wiped out the enemy. The pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima was ineffective for many reasons, but chief among them was a lack of imagination on the part of the US Navy. That, combined with a determined and cunning Japanese defense, is what produced the bloodiest battle in the history of the US Marine Corps.